Hi, my name is Vidar Husby from the International Deliberate Practice Society, and this is my friend and colleague Alexandre Vaz from Sentio University. Today we're going to walk you through the 5 key steps of deliberate practice. Let's jump into it. First step is identifying a client to focus on. In this step, we are really aiming for the client that is responding the least to therapy, your patient that is struggling the most. This is a person that is hard to identify. It's difficult for therapists to make a good guess of who this is. So what we really recommend is to use objective outcome data to help you with this. But if you don't have that, you can use your subjective opinion, or you can simply pick the client that makes you the most anxious.
So after you choose a client that you want to focus on, you move on to the next step, which is to identify a clinical challenge. And in our jargon, that means something very specific. A clinical challenge is something that the client says or does that is probably impeding therapy progress. And it's something that you, the therapist, have a hard time responding to. For example, let's imagine a clinical challenge of a client who comes into the session and says, I don't like coming to therapy, I'm thinking about quitting. That would be something very specific that the client says or does that is probably relevant for the therapy. And for many therapists, this would be a hard statement to answer, to intervene effectively to. Then we move on to identifying your skill deficit. And skill deficit is also very specific to our jargon in the world of practice here. Skill deficit is what you tend to do in response to this clinical challenge that isn't effective. For example, in the case of the client that says, I don't like coming to therapy, I'm thinking about quitting. Let's imagine we watched a videotape of you working with this client, and in response to this clinical challenge, you start changing the subject, or you start arguing with your client, which I think we can all agree probably wouldn't be super effective. That would be your skill deficit, the thing that you're doing that you'd like to change. And we just want to mention that it's very tempting to skip over this step of identifying your skill deficit, what you do that isn't so helpful. But we really encourage you to do it because A, you will learn a lot more about you as you try to pinpoint what are you doing that isn't as helpful. And B, by doing so, you'll get a much better grasp for what you want to do instead. So again, identify the client you want to focus on, something very specific that they say or do that you want to address, the skill deficit, something that you're usually doing that isn't so helpful and that you want to change. And then we move on to the next step of the process.
So the third step is identifying a learning goal. The learning goal describes a response to the clinical challenge. In Alex's example, the clinical challenge is that the client expresses that he doesn't like coming to therapy. And you might have a habitual response to this that is not helpful. Understandably, it's a very difficult situation. And most therapists struggle with these kinds of situations. But a learning goal for this kind of challenge could, for example, be A, validate the statement from the client, and B, try to explore the client's experience. That would be the 2 learning goals for this clinical challenge. So notice that this learning goal is not we don't spell out what the therapist is supposed to say. We formulate 2 criteria, which is validate and explore, that the therapist can meet with his own words. Now, there's many learning goals that you could meet a clinical challenge like this with. We make our best guess based on research, clinical experience, or your therapeutic model of choice to suggest a response that we would like to try out, that we think with probability would be a better response than what you used to do, or that you wanted to improve, right? So I also have to mention that when we talk about the small learning goal, that it has to be tailored to your zone of proximal development. It mustn't be too easy or too hard, but it's like it has to challenge you just a little bit. It has to be just outside your comfort zone. It has to be very specific, and most of all, it has to focus on the therapist's performance. So we try to formulate this learning goal in verbal and non-verbal therapist behavior. If we do it like that, it's much easier to go to the next step.
So the next step is to do behavioral rehearsal. Now, this is really what sets apart the lawyer practice from most other psychotherapy trainings, because up until now, it's been pretty conceptual, pretty cognitive, right? We've identified a client, a clinical challenge, skill deficit, learning goal, but now we're actually going to practice a skill, right? Not just think about a skill, but actually rehearse it. So the way you do it, there's different ways you can do it, but the two major ways is either using a recording of your client. So you can actually pick an audio or video recording of your client, play it back to you. That excerpt that you're playing should be representative of the clinical challenge that you identified. And then you, in real time, you practice this clinical skill, this learning goal that you've identified. So for example, if I had a videotape of my client saying, I don't like coming to therapy, I'm thinking about quitting, I could literally play that clip and talk back to the screen as if I'm with that client right now. And I would practice repeatedly, right? And the important thing about this kind of behavior rehearsal is it's not a free-form role play where, it's just going on and on the video. It's focused very specifically on that very specific clinical challenge, and I'm repeating my intervention and I'm refining it over and over, right? So this is quite different from most versions of psychotherapy training. So again, one way to do it is using the video recording. The other way is using a small role play system with either a peer or with a colleague, a teacher, supervisor, where the teacher, supervisor, colleague, or peer are playing repeatedly, are role playing, I should say, that client statement that you're focusing on, that clinical challenge, and you're repeatedly answering, trying to refine your intervention. And that's really promoting what's called state-dependent learning, because you're putting actual action into something that you want to hopefully be able to do next time you see the client.
The fifth step of deliberate practice is assessing performance. Now, we have done a bunch of behavioral rehearsal, and we want to see if our rehearsal reaches all the way to the client. So there's two things that we want to assess. The first is the therapist's in-session behavior. Did it change? Do you master the skill that you have been rehearsing to be able to do? The second thing we want to assess is the client's outcome. Is the client benefiting from your practice?
So Vidar just went over the fifth step, assessing performance, and I just want to point out that this model is a cycle, meaning that once you finish this step, the work never stops, basically. Now you get to the start again, which is identifying a client that you want to focus on, and you'll see, maybe you'll focus on the same client with different clinical challenges that you still may want to practice different skills to, or over time, if this client does get better for your practice, you might focus on a different client with new clinical challenges. But we want to emphasize that this is a lifelong process, and all experts in all fields that use the lawyer practice have lifelong learning, meaning you'll be using this cycle over and over, and there's never a point where you've mastered all the skills, mastered all the clinical challenges, right? So the important thing is just to keep going and try to create a culture around you with nice people who help support you in this hard but awesome task of lifelong learning. So that's all we wanted to share with you today. Of course, there's a lot of little nuances in each of these steps, but for all of those nuances, the good news is that you have a lot of free resources in the International Lawyer Practice Society. It's called the IDPS. And also, the IDPS has been perfecting a supervisor training over the past few years. So if you're a teacher or supervisor who wants to learn the skills of the lawyer practice and how to use these steps with your trainees or your supervisees, I would recommend that you go to IDPS website and you talk to the nice people over there, because that's literally what they've been doing for a couple of years now, is how to help train supervisors and teachers on this. If you're a trainee or just a licensed therapist, there's a lot of resources there for you to benefit for your own solitary practice. So you might also get something out of checking that out. Another place you might want to go for more delaware practice resources is the newly found Sentio Counseling Center and Sentio University. And Sentio University is this project in North America where the people involved are actually trying to create a new training that half of all the training is delaware practice based. So there's a lot of delaware practice resources there. It's kind of a social experiment because nothing like that has ever been done, but we're very hopeful that in creating a system where delaware practice is built into psychotherapy training from the get-go, that you're going to get even more clinical skills training out of it. So I think that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank my wonderful friend Vidar for all the wonderful work he's been doing at the IDPS, he and the team at the IDPS. And yeah, and all you guys who have been watching, good practice. And please don't try to do everything by yourself all alone, because practice really is much more sustainable if you have a good, healthy culture around you encouraging you to do it.